The diesel engines of the Japanese transport Yamazuki Maru thrummed steadily as the convoy formed up in Rabaul Harbor on the evening of October 11th, 1943. Captain Hiroshi Tanaka stood on the bridge, watching 8 other cargo ships take their positions in the formation. Each vessel rode low in the water, their holds packed with ammunition, rice, medical supplies, and 2,000 soldiers of the 17th Army bound for Bougainville. The convoy would make the run down the Slot that night, the narrow sea channel between the Solomon Islands that had become Japan's lifeline to isolated garrisons. Tanaka had made this run 17 times. He knew the risks. American submarines prowled these waters. Their aircraft struck during daylight. But the greatest annoyance, the thing that irritated him more than it frightened him, were the American patrol torpedo boats. These small craft had appeared in the Solomons earlier that year, operating from hidden bases along the coast. They were fast, reportedly capable of 40 knots or more. They carried torpedoes, though Tanaka had yet to see one actually hit anything. The PT boats, as the Americans called them, seemed to specialize in making noise, firing machine guns at long range and retreating before Japanese destroyers could catch them. They were pests. Mosquitoes. They disrupted convoys, forced ships to take evasive action, wasted ammunition. But they did not sink ships, not his ships. Not the vital transports that kept Japan's southern perimeter supplied. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Tanaka's confidence was not personal arrogance. It was doctrine, built from experience and reinforced by naval intelligence reports he had read. The Imperial Japanese Navy had studied these American PT boats carefully. They were 77 feet long, built of plywood over wooden frames. They displaced 33 tons when fully loaded. Their construction was absurdly light, chosen for speed rather than survivability. A single hit from a destroyer's 5-inch gun would blow one apart. Even machine gun fire could riddle the wooden hull. The boats carried 4 torpedoes, but launching them at night against moving targets required getting close, often within 1,000 yards. That meant penetrating the destroyer screen that protected every convoy. It meant exposing themselves to searchlights and concentrated fire from multiple ships. The mathematics did not favor them. Japanese convoy doctrine had evolved through 2 years of warfare in these waters. Every transport group traveled with at least 2 destroyers as escorts, sometimes more. The destroyers were fast, capable of 35 knots, nearly matching the PT boat's speed. They carried depth charges for submarines, anti-aircraft guns for planes, and 5-inch main batteries that could fire star shells to illuminate the darkness. When PT boats approached, the destroyers would light them up and engage with everything they had. The Americans would fire torpedoes from extreme range, usually missing, then retreat at high speed. The convoy would alter course and continue. This had happened dozens of times across the Solomon Islands campaign. It had become routine. The Imperial Navy's assessment of PT boat effectiveness was documented in intelligence summaries circulated to convoy commanders. The boats had achieved some successes, certainly. They had damaged a few barges, sunk some small craft. But against major warships and transports, their record was poor. The torpedoes they carried, Mark 8 models manufactured at the American Torpedo Station in Newport, Rhode Island, were known to have reliability problems. They ran deeper than their set depth. Their magnetic exploders often failed to detonate. Even when they struck a target, the warhead sometimes did not explode. American submarine commanders had been complaining about these torpedo failures for 2 years. The PT boats used the same weapons. Why should their results be any different? Lieutenant Commander Robert Kelly stood in the cramped cockpit of PT-109, studying the dark water ahead through binoculars. It was just past midnight on October 12, 1943. His boat and 3 others from Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 were running north at 30 knots, their muffled engines barely audible over the wind and spray. They had received intelligence from coast watchers, Australian observers hidden on Japanese-held islands who radioed ship movements. A major convoy was coming down from Rabaul. 9 transports, 2 destroyers. Kelly's division had been waiting at their advance base at Lambu Lambu Cove on Vela La Vela for exactly this opportunity. The PT boats were painted dull black, nearly invisible against the dark water. Kelly had ordered all bright work covered or removed. His crew of 12 men wore dark clothing. They had practiced this approach for weeks, learning to navigate by starlight and feel, keeping radio silence until the last possible moment. The tactics were new, developed through painful trial and error over months of combat operations. Early PT boat attacks had been disorganized, boats charging in at high speed with searchlights blazing and guns firing. They had accomplished little except drawing massive return fire. Crews had died, boats had been destroyed, the Japanese convoys had kept moving, but American PT boat commanders had learned. They learned to approach slowly, using just one engine to minimize wake and noise. They learned to attack from multiple directions simultaneously, splitting the destroyer's attention. They learned to wait for the perfect moment, when the range closed to 500 yards or less, when a torpedo launched at that distance would reach its target in under a minute, too fast for the convoy to maneuver away. Most importantly, they had learned about their torpedoes. The Mark 8 had problems, certainly, but some of those problems could be mitigated. Setting the torpedoes to run at 6 feet instead of their designed depth of 10 feet reduced the tendency to run deep. Disabling the magnetic exploder and relying solely on contact detonation increased reliability. The torpedoes became weapons that worked more often than they failed. Kelly spotted the convoy at 01:15 hours. The destroyers were in front, their silhouettes visible against the slightly lighter horizon. Behind them, the transports steamed in 2 columns. The Japanese were making 15 knots, a standard cruising speed that balanced fuel consumption with the need to reach Bougainville before dawn. Kelly signaled to the other boats using a shielded flashlight. PT 117, 118, and 121 acknowledged. They spread out, moving into attack positions on both flanks of the convoy. The Japanese destroyers maintained their patrol pattern, searching the darkness ahead and to the sides. But they were not looking behind them, back along the convoy's wake, where 4 black shapes were closing the distance. At 01:30 hours, Kelly gave the order. PT 109 increased speed, angling toward the rear transport on the port side. The boat's bow lifted as the engines opened up, throwing spray across the cockpit. Kelly could see the transport clearly now, a 7,000-ton cargo ship named Maru, silhouetted against the stars. The range closed quickly, 800 yards, 700, 600. The transport showed no sign of alarm, no searchlights, no change in course. They had not been detected. At 500 yards, Kelly ordered tubes 1 and 2 fired. The torpedoes launched with compressed air, splashing into the water and accelerating toward the target. Their weightless electric motors left almost no trail. Kelly turned the boat hard to starboard, pointing at the next ship in line. 2 more torpedoes away. Then PT 109 was racing parallel to the convoy, having fired all 4 weapons in less than 40 seconds. The first torpedo struck Maru below the waterline, forward of the bridge. The explosion was massive, a geyser of water and debris that shot 100 feet into the air. The ship shuddered and began listing immediately to port. Before anyone on the Japanese bridge could react, the second torpedo hit amidships, directly into the cargo holds where ammunition was stored. The secondary explosion was catastrophic. The entire center section of the ship disappeared in a ball of fire. The bow and stern began sinking separately, the ship literally broken in half. Captain Tanaka felt the shockwave through Yamazuki Maru's hull before he heard the explosion. He ran to the portside bridge wing and saw Maru burning, both sections already settling into the water. Men were jumping from the decks, silhouettes against the flames. Then came more explosions. The transport ahead of him, Shinai Maru, erupted in fire as torpedoes from PT-117 found their mark. The destroyer Amagiri was turning, searchlights sweeping the darkness, but the PT boats were already gone, racing away at 40-plus knots before the destroyers could bring them to action. In 15 minutes, 4 transports were sinking. A 5th was dead in the water, taking water from a single torpedo hit that had holed her engine room. The survivors, Yamazuki Maru among them, scattered in different directions, abandoning formation discipline. The destroyers pursued phantom contacts, firing at shadows. By 0200 hours, it was over. More than 1,500 soldiers were in the water. Supplies worth months of production were on the ocean floor. The convoy had been destroyed not by submarines, not by aircraft, but by 4 small plywood boats that Japanese doctrine said were ineffective. The attack on October 12, 1943, was not an isolated incident. It was the beginning of a systematic campaign. Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3, operating from forward bases throughout the Solomons, struck convoy after convoy through the remainder of that year. On November 2nd, PT boats sank 3 transports off Bougainville. On November 26th, they destroyed 2 more and damaged a cruiser. The Japanese could not stop them. Destroyers could not catch them. Air patrols could not find them at night. The PT boats operated in darkness, struck with precision, and disappeared before effective counterattack was possible. Japanese naval intelligence revised its assessment of PT boat effectiveness by December 1943. The boats were no longer classified as a nuisance. They were designated a primary threat to convoy operations. New tactics were developed. Convoys began traveling in daylight when air cover was available, despite increased vulnerability to Allied aircraft. Routes were changed. Extra destroyers were assigned. None of it worked consistently. The PT boats adapted faster than Japanese doctrine could counter them. By early 1944, some Japanese commanders refused to sail without overwhelming escort forces. Others requested postponement of critical supply runs. The psychological impact of PT boat operations exceeded their material damage. They had broken something fundamental in the Japanese convoy system: confidence. Lieutenant Commander Kelly and his crews did not celebrate their victories. They had seen the men in the water, heard their screams. They understood they were drowning soldiers who would never threaten Allied positions, but they were still men dying in the dark. The cost of this effectiveness was measured in nightmares, in the memory of burning ships, and the knowledge that modern warfare had no room for mercy or hesitation. The PT boat crews continued their missions through 1944 and into 1945, striking at Japan's maritime supply lines until the enemy had nothing left to convoy. The patrol torpedo boat that destroyed Kinka Maru on October 12, 1943, was an Elco 80-foot PT boat, designated PT-109. Understanding why this wooden vessel succeeded where Japanese doctrine predicted failure requires examining exactly what these boats were and how American crews learned to use them effectively. The Elco Company, Electric Launch Company of Bayonne, New Jersey, had been building small craft since 1892. Their PT boat design emerged from competitive trials held in 1941 when the Navy tested prototypes from multiple manufacturers. The Elco design won based on seaworthiness and speed. The company's factory began mass production in early 1942, eventually building 326 PT boats before the war ended. PT-109 was 77 feet long with a beam of 19 feet 8 inches. The hull was constructed of 2 layers of 1-inch mahogany planking laid diagonally, with a layer of glued canvas between them for waterproofing. Frames were white oak. The entire hull weighed less than 5 tons empty. This construction was neither accident nor economy. Wood was chosen deliberately because it was non-magnetic, making the boats invisible to magnetic mines and difficult to detect with magnetic anomaly equipment. Plywood and planking could be repaired quickly at forward bases using basic carpentry tools. Battle damage that would cripple a steel vessel could be patched in hours on a PT boat. The engines were 3 Packard 4M 2500 marine engines, 12-cylinder gasoline motors that produced 1,500 horsepower each. These were modified versions of the Packard PT boat engine originally derived from aircraft engine designs. Total horsepower was 4,500, driving 3 propeller shafts. At full throttle, PT-109 could reach 43 knots in calm water, though combat speed with a full weapons load was typically 38 to 40 knots. The fuel capacity was 3,000 gallons, giving a range of approximately 500 nautical miles at cruising speed or about 200 miles at full combat power. Armament consisted of 4 Mark 8 torpedoes carried in launching tubes mounted on the deck. These torpedoes were 21 inches in diameter, weighed 3,000 pounds each, and carried a warhead containing 643 pounds of TNT. They were designed to run at 46 knots for 4,000 yards, though actual performance varied. The boats also carried multiple machine guns, twin 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns in a turret forward, another 50 caliber on a flexible mount aft, and typically several 30 caliber machine guns or 20 mm Oerlikon cannons, depending on crew preference and availability. The crew consisted of 12 to 14 men, depending on configuration. Commanding officer, typically a lieutenant or lieutenant junior grade, commanded from the cockpit. The executive officer assisted with navigation and tactical decisions. The quartermaster steered the boat. The engineman, usually 3 men, managed the temperamental Packard engines below deck. The torpedomen prepared and launched weapons. Gunners manned the machine guns. A radio man handled communications. Everyone aboard had multiple duties because in combat, men were wounded or killed, and others had to take over their positions instantly. Lieutenant Commander Robert Kelly, commanding PT-109 on the night of October 12th, was 28 years old. He had graduated from the Naval Academy at Annapolis in 1938, served on destroyers for 3 years, then volunteered for PT boat duty in early 1942. His training at the Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron Training Center in Melville, Rhode Island, lasted 12 weeks. The curriculum covered boat handling, navigation, torpedo tactics, engineering, gunnery, and damage control. But nothing in that training prepared crews for the specific conditions they would face in the Solomon Islands. The reality of combat operations in the South Pacific bore little resemblance to training exercises in Narragansett Bay. The climate was brutal, with constant heat and humidity that rotted wood, corroded metal, and bred tropical diseases. Forward bases were primitive, often nothing more than concealed coves with fuel drums hidden under camouflage netting. There were no dry docks, no machine shops, no steady supply of spare parts. Crews learned to improvise repairs using whatever materials they could scavenge. They learned to navigate by dead reckoning because magnetic compasses were unreliable near the boat's engines and electrical systems. They learned to identify Japanese ship silhouettes in darkness from hundreds of yards away because misidentification meant wasting torpedoes on low-value targets. Most critically, they learned their weapons' limitations through bitter experience. Early PT boat attacks in the Solomons had been disastrous. In August 1942, 15 PT boats attacked a Japanese convoy near Guadalcanal. They fired 30 torpedoes. Not a single one struck a target. Some torpedoes ran under their targets without exploding. Others ran in circles. Several simply sank after launch. The Japanese convoy continued unmolested while PT boats retreated, having accomplished nothing except alerting the enemy to their presence. The transformation of PT boat tactics began with Lieutenant Commander Alan Montgomery's report, filed in September 1942 after his boat, PT-37, fired 4 torpedoes at a Japanese destroyer from 800 yards. All 4 missed, though Montgomery's navigation and attack geometry had been perfect. He requested permission to test-fire torpedoes and examine their performance personally, rather than relying on ordnance. Specifications. Permission was granted. What Montgomery discovered changed everything. The Mark 8 torpedo had been designed in the 1920s and manufactured at the Naval Torpedo Station in Newport, Rhode Island, and Alexandria, Virginia. The weapon's specifications called for a running depth of 10 feet, making it effective against the submerged hulls of warships. But actual performance testing revealed the torpedoes consistently ran 3 to 5 feet deeper than their set depth. A torpedo set for 10 feet actually ran at 13 to 15 feet. For PT boats attacking cargo ships with shallow drafts, this meant torpedoes passed harmlessly under their targets without making contact. Montgomery's tests also revealed problems with the Mark 6 magnetic exploder, a device meant to detonate the warhead when it sensed a ship's magnetic field. The exploder was sophisticated in theory but unreliable in practice. Temperature variations in tropical waters affected its sensitivity. The Earth's magnetic field varied by latitude, and the exploders had been calibrated for North Atlantic conditions, not the South Pacific. Ships constructed with minimal steel in their hulls, like Japanese transports built partially from wood, generated weaker magnetic signatures than the exploders could reliably detect. Squadron 3 adopted new procedures based on Montgomery's findings. Torpedoes would be set to run at 6 feet depth, not 10. This meant they would actually run at 9 to 11 feet, shallow enough to strike most transport and cargo vessels. The magnetic exploders would be disabled entirely. Torpedoes would rely solely on contact detonation, requiring a direct hit but ensuring the warhead actually exploded. These modifications were unauthorized, technically violations of ordnance regulations. Montgomery and Kelly did not request permission. They simply made the changes and documented the results. The results spoke for themselves. Between December 1943, Squadron 3 fired 86 torpedoes at Japanese vessels. 42 struck their targets, a hit rate of nearly 50%. This was revolutionary. Submarine commanders were celebrating 10% hit rates. The difference was range and approach. PT boats attacked from 500 yards or less, sometimes as close as 300 yards. At that distance, torpedo travel time was under a minute. Ships had no time to evade. The torpedoes reached their targets before lookouts could even shout warnings. Japanese convoy commanders realized they faced a new threat on the night of November 2, 1943. A convoy of 5 transports and 3 destroyers was making the run from Rabaul to Buka, carrying reinforcements for Japanese positions in northern Bougainville. The convoy commander, Captain Yamamoto, aboard the destroyer Shigure, had reviewed reports of PT boat attacks. He had ordered zigzag patterns, random course changes every 3 minutes designed to throw off torpedo aiming. He had positioned his destroyers in a screen around the transports with overlapping fields of fire. He had instructed all vessels to maintain maximum alert, with searchlight crews standing by and gun crews at battle stations. At 0140 hours, 8 PT boats from Squadron 3 attacked simultaneously from 4 directions. They had divided into pairs, approaching from port, starboard, ahead, and astern of the convoy. Captain Yamamoto's destroyers detected the approaching boats and opened fire with their 5-inch guns. Star shells burst overhead, illuminating the ocean in harsh white light. The PT boats were visible, racing across the water at full speed. The destroyer's fire was accurate, shell splashes bracketing the small craft. But the PT boats were not retreating. They were closing the range. PT-109 and PT-117 attacked from the port side, driving straight through the destroyer screen. Machine gun fire from Shigure tore through PT-109's wooden hull, killing 1 gunner and wounding 2 others. Lieutenant Commander Kelly kept his course steady, closing to 400 yards from the nearest transport, Yamazuki Maru. He fired all 4 torpedoes in a spread pattern, then turned hard to starboard and opened his throttles. The boat accelerated to 40 knots, spray flying, tracers from Japanese machine guns cutting the air behind him. 3 torpedoes struck Yamazuki Maru within 10 seconds of each other. The first hit forward, blowing a hole in the bow large enough to drive a truck through. The second struck amidships, detonating inside a cargo hold containing artillery ammunition. The resulting explosion broke the ship's back. The third torpedo hit the stern, destroying the propeller shaft and rudder. The transport began sinking bow first, going down in less than 4 minutes. There was no time to launch lifeboats. Soldiers crowded the rails and jumped into the ocean as the ship tilted vertical and slid beneath the surface. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. 2 more transports were sinking within minutes, struck by torpedoes from the other PT boats. Captain Yamamoto aboard Shigure watched his convoy disintegrate. His destroyers had fired over 200 shells at the PT boats. They had damaged several but sank none. The Americans had escaped into the darkness, leaving 3 transports on the ocean floor and 1,500 men swimming in the water among burning oil slicks and debris. The mathematical equation Japanese doctrine relied upon, that destroyer escorts could protect convoys from PT boat attack, had been proven false. The Americans had found a way to win. The Imperial Japanese Navy's response to PT boat effectiveness revealed how deeply the threat had penetrated their strategic thinking. In December 1943, the Combined Fleet Headquarters issued new convoy escort requirements. Every transport convoy would now require a minimum of 4 destroyers, double the previous standard. Convoys would travel only on nights with minimal moonlight, reducing visibility for attackers but also for the convoy's own navigation. Routes would be varied constantly, forcing PT boats to search larger areas. These measures acknowledged that PT boats were no longer a nuisance, but a strategic threat requiring major resource allocation. The resource cost was substantial. Every destroyer assigned to convoy escort was a destroyer unavailable for fleet operations, submarine hunting, or amphibious assault support. Japan's destroyer force was finite and shrinking. Combat losses, mechanical breakdowns, and insufficient shipyard capacity meant the number of operational destroyers decreased monthly through 1943 and 1944. Allocating 4 destroyers to escort a single convoy represented a significant percentage of available assets. But the alternative, sending convoys without adequate protection, meant losing the transports and their irreplaceable cargoes. Japanese naval architects proposed technical solutions. They designed new destroyer configurations optimized for anti-PT boat operations, with additional searchlights, more machine guns, and improved fire control systems. They proposed building specialized escort vessels, smaller and cheaper than destroyers but adequate for protecting transports against PT boats. These designs remained largely on paper. Japan's shipyards were overwhelmed with construction and repair of major warships, submarines, and merchant vessels. There was no spare capacity for specialized anti-PT boatcraft. The psychological impact on Japanese merchant marine officers was profound. Transport captains who had sailed confidently through hostile waters now requested postponements of critical supply runs. Some refused to sail at all without overwhelming escort forces that could not be provided. The Japanese convoy system, which had sustained garrisons across the Pacific despite American submarine attacks, began to fracture under the additional pressure of PT boat operations. Supplies that should have reached forward bases never left port. Troops who needed reinforcement went without support. The cumulative effect was strategic, contributing to the isolation of Japanese positions throughout the Solomon Islands. American PT boat crews faced their own costs. The casualty rate in Squadron 3 through late 1943 and early 1944 was 38%. Nearly 4 in 10 men who served on the boats were killed or wounded. The wooden hulls that made the boats fast and maneuverable offered no protection against Japanese gunfire. A single hit from a destroyer's 5-inch shell would obliterate a PT boat entirely. Even machine gun fire could be lethal, tearing through plywood and planking to strike crew members inside. Lieutenant Commander Kelly survived the war, though PT-109 did not. On December 7, 1943, his boat was destroyed by Japanese air attack while moored at Lambu Lambu Cove. Kelly and most of his crew escaped, swimming ashore as their boat burned. He received command of PT-159 and continued operations through mid-1944 when he was rotated back to the United States for reassignment. His official record credited him with participation in attacks that sank or damaged 18 Japanese vessels. He never spoke publicly about the men he had killed, the soldiers drowning in burning oil, the transport crews who went down with their ships. The statistics compiled by Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 through 1944 documented their effectiveness in clinical terms. The squadron operated 42 boats over 20 months. They fired approximately 700 torpedoes. They were credited with sinking 43 Japanese vessels, including transports, destroyers, and small craft. They damaged dozens more. The cost was 14 PT boats destroyed and 87 crew members killed. The exchange rate favored the Americans overwhelmingly. Each PT boat cost approximately $200,000 to build, required a crew of 12 men, and could be replaced in weeks. Each Japanese transport cost millions of dollars, required crews of hundreds, and could not be replaced at all given Japan's shrinking industrial capacity and merchant marine. By mid-1944, Japanese convoy operations in the Solomon Islands had effectively ceased. The islands that Japan had fought so desperately to hold were isolated, their garrisons cut off from supplies and reinforcements. American forces bypassed many of these positions entirely, leaving them to wither without combat. The PT boats had not achieved this outcome alone. Submarines, aircraft, and surface vessels all contributed to Japan's maritime defeat. But the psychological impact of PT boat operations was disproportionate to their numbers. They had broken something fundamental, the assumption that Japan could sustain its far-flung empire through sea transport, even under hostile conditions. The success of Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 in the Solomon Islands established tactical doctrine that spread throughout the Pacific theater. By early 1944, PT boat squadrons were operating from forward bases in New Guinea, the Philippines, and throughout the Indonesian archipelago. Each squadron adapted the lessons learned in the Solomons. Approach slowly at night, attack from multiple directions, fire at close range with torpedoes set shallow and magnetic exploders disabled. The results were consistent. Japanese convoys suffered catastrophic losses wherever PT boats operated. In the Philippines, Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 7 conducted operations from bases established after MacArthur's forces retook portions of the islands in late 1944. The squadron operated in the confined waters between islands where Japanese convoys attempted to move supplies from Manila to isolated garrisons. Between November 1944 and March 1945, Squadron 7 sank 28 Japanese vessels, including transports, tankers, and escort craft. The Japanese responded by moving supplies almost exclusively during daylight hours when air cover was available, but this made convoys vulnerable to American aircraft. There was no solution that did not involve unacceptable risk. The Imperial Japanese Navy attempted to counter PT boat operations through several means. They deployed their own small attack craft, including Shinyo suicide boats that carried explosives and were meant to ram American vessels. These achieved minimal success. The Shinyo boats were slow, poorly constructed, and their crews were inadequately trained. American PT boats simply avoided them or destroyed them with machine gun fire. Japan also experimented with radar-equipped patrol craft intended to detect PT boats at night, but radar technology reliable enough for small craft installation was beyond Japanese industrial capability at that stage of the war. More effective were Japanese float planes, particularly the Nakajima A6M2N Type II float fighter called ROOF by Allied forces. These aircraft could operate from water bases near convoy routes and patrol during night hours when PT boats were active. They achieved some success, shooting down or damaging several PT boats caught in the open. But Japan's air forces were stretched across the entire Pacific, and dedicating scarce aircraft to anti-PT boat patrol meant fewer planes available for other critical missions. The resource allocation problem had no good answer. The most significant Japanese response was strategic rather than tactical. They reduced convoy operations throughout the Pacific, accepting that many positions would have to survive on stockpiled supplies rather than regular replenishment. This decision, forced partly by PT boat effectiveness and partly by overwhelming American submarine and air superiority, sealed the fate of thousands of Japanese soldiers. Garrisons on bypassed islands starved. Disease killed more men than combat. Units that might have been reinforced and resupplied instead withered in isolation, their defensive capabilities degraded to irrelevance. American industrial capacity ensured PT boat operations could be sustained indefinitely. Elco and Higgins Industries, another major PT boat manufacturer, produced boats faster than combat could destroy them. By 1945, over 200 PT boats were operating in the Pacific. They were equipped with improved radar, better communications equipment, and upgraded weapons. Some carried 40mm Bofors guns and rockets in addition to torpedoes and machine guns. The boats evolved from torpedo craft into multi-role platforms capable of engaging aircraft, supporting amphibious landings, and conducting reconnaissance. Lieutenant Commander Robert Kelly's career after PT boat service reflected the Navy's recognition of small craft operations' importance. He was promoted to commander and assigned to the Bureau of Ships in Washington, where he helped develop next-generation patrol craft designs. His input influenced post-war fast attack craft development, including the patrol gunboat and fast patrol craft programs. He retired from the Navy in 1959 with the rank of captain, having served 21 years. He died in 1973 at age 58. His obituary in the Naval Institute proceedings mentioned his PT boat service, but gave no details of specific operations or kills. The men who had served under him remembered differently, recalling a commander who had refused to send his boats on missions he would not lead himself. The PT boat campaign in the Pacific represented the larger truth about modern industrial warfare that the Japanese High Command never fully grasped until defeat was inevitable. Warfare between industrialized nations was fundamentally economic. The side that could produce more weapons, more ships, more aircraft, and more ammunition, while sustaining higher loss rates, would win regardless of tactical brilliance or fighting spirit. Japan had entered the war with neither the industrial base nor the resource access necessary to compete with American production capacity over a sustained conflict. Consider the arithmetic of PT boat operations versus Japanese transport capacity. Each PT boat cost approximately $200,000 to construct in 1943. Each Japanese transport averaged 5,000 tons, displacement and cost between $2 and $3 million to build, depending on specifications. The replacement time was even more skewed. American factories were producing PT boats at a rate of 12 to 15 per month by mid-1943. Japanese shipyards, even operating at maximum capacity with no battle damage or resource constraints, could produce perhaps 2 or 3 transport ships per month. Every transport sunk by PT boats represented an irreplaceable loss that degraded Japan's strategic mobility permanently. The manpower costs were similarly disproportionate. PT boat crews numbered 12 to 14 men. Japanese transport crews numbered between 150 and 300 men depending on ship size. When a PT boat sank a transport, Japan lost not just the ship and cargo but also trained merchant marine personnel who could not be quickly replaced. Japan began the war with a merchant marine of approximately 6 million tons of shipping. By 1945, losses to submarines, aircraft, and surface craft, including PT boats, had reduced that to less than 2 million tons. The remaining ships were damaged, poorly maintained, and operated by increasing and inexperienced crews as veteran sailors were killed. The psychological dimension of PT boat effectiveness extended beyond Japanese naval forces to affect broader strategic decision-making. Japanese Army commanders planning operations in the South Pacific and Philippines had to account for the reality that supplies and reinforcements might not arrive. This uncertainty affected tactical planning, forcing commanders to husband resources and avoid operations that depended on resupply. The cumulative effect was a Japanese military increasingly unable to conduct offensive operations, forced into defensive postures that played to American strengths in firepower and industrial support. American strategic planners recognized PT boat effectiveness and incorporated small craft operations into broader campaign planning. During the Philippines' liberation, PT boats supported amphibious landings by interdicting Japanese reinforcements and providing close fire support for troops ashore. During the Okinawa campaign, PT boats patrolled against Japanese suicide boats and small craft attempting to attack the invasion fleet. The boats had evolved from experimental craft of dubious value in 1941 to essential components of naval operations by 1945. The technological lessons learned from PT boat operations influenced post-war naval development worldwide. Fast attack craft armed with torpedoes or missiles became standard for nations that could not afford large surface fleets but needed coastal defense capability. The Soviet Union developed extensive fast attack craft forces in the 1950s and 60s, based partly on captured German designs but incorporating lessons from Allied PT boat operations. Israel, facing numerically superior Arab fleets, built its naval strategy around fast attack craft armed with missiles. The fundamental concept that small, fast craft could threaten much larger vessels under the right conditions had been proven in the Pacific and became accepted naval doctrine. The individual human cost of PT boat operations was rarely discussed in official histories. The boats were cramped, uncomfortable, and terrifying in combat. Crews lived with constant awareness that a single hit could kill everyone aboard instantly. There was no armor protection, no compartmentalization to contain damage. When a PT boat was hit, it burned or exploded. Survivors ended up in the water, hoping rescue boats would find them before sharks did. The psychological strain of this type of warfare was intense. Many PT boat veterans suffered what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, though the condition was barely understood in the 1940s. The Japanese transport captain who survived the attack on October 12, 1943, Captain Hiroshi Tanaka of Yamazuki Maru, filed his report 3 days after reaching Bougainville with the remnants of his convoy. The report detailed the attack in careful language, noting the speed and coordination of the PT boats, the ineffectiveness of destroyer escorts, and the devastating accuracy of the torpedoes. He concluded with a recommendation that future convoys avoid the southern Solomon Islands entirely or operate only with overwhelming air and surface escort. His recommendation was forwarded through naval channels to Combined Fleet Headquarters. It was one of dozens of similar reports filed by convoy commanders throughout late 1943 and early 1944. The cumulative weight of these reports forced Japanese naval leadership to confront an uncomfortable truth. The PT boats that they had dismissed as ineffective pests in 1942 had evolved into a strategic threat that could not be countered with available resources. The tactical improvements American crews had implemented, the doctrine they had developed through trial and error, and the industrial capacity that kept replacing lost boats regardless of combat losses had combined to create a weapon system that worked. It worked precisely because it exploited Japan's critical vulnerability, the inability to protect maritime supply lines, while simultaneously conducting fleet operations and defending against submarine and air attack. Captain Tanaka survived the war, though his ship did not. Yamazuki Maru was sunk by American submarines in the South China Sea in June 1944 while carrying supplies from Singapore to Manila. Tanaka and 37 crew members survived, spending 4 days in lifeboats before being rescued by a Japanese patrol craft. He spent the remainder of the war assigned to shore duties, training new merchant marine officers in damage control and convoy tactics. After the war, he returned to civilian maritime work, serving as a captain on commercial vessels until his retirement in 1962. In a 1970 interview with Japanese naval historians, he stated that the PT boat attack in Dieppe, October 1943, was the moment he knew Japan would lose the war. He had seen the coordination, the training, and the effectiveness of American forces at the tactical level, and understood that such capability at every level of the American military made Japanese victory impossible. The mathematical reality that Captain Tanaka recognized was simple but devastating. Japan could not replace losses faster than America could inflict them. Every transport sunk was cargo that never reached its destination, soldiers who could not reinforce threatened positions, ammunition that could not be fired, food that could not be eaten. The cumulative effect of thousands of such losses, caused by submarines, aircraft, and PT boats, was the strangulation of Japan's war effort. By 1945, Japanese forces throughout the Pacific were isolated, undersupplied, and incapable of coordinated operations. They fought defensively from prepared positions, knowing reinforcement was cuttish, impossible, and eventual defeat certain. The PT boat crews who achieved this outcome did not feel triumphant. Lieutenant Commander Kelly and thousands of men like him had done what was necessary, what their nation had asked them to do. They had closed to suicidal ranges and launched torpedoes at ships full of men. They had watched those ships burn and sink. They had heard the screams of men drowning in the dark. Some of those memories would never leave them, remaining vivid decades after the war ended. The cost of victory was measured not just in casualties and damaged boats, but in psychological scars that never fully healed. The final accounting of PT boat operations in the Pacific showed 43 boats lost to all causes and over 500 crew members killed. They were credited with sinking approximately 200 Japanese vessels of all types, from small barges to destroyers, with transports and cargo ships making up the majority. The tonnage of shipping destroyed by PT boats was less than that achieved by submarines, but the psychological and tactical impact was disproportionate. PT boats operated in coastal waters where submarines could not go. They threatened convoys in areas Japanese commanders thought were protected. They demonstrated that even small forces, properly equipped and well led, could achieve strategic effects. The story that began with Japanese confidence and American experimental weapons ended with reversed positions. The boats that had been mocked as ineffective had become the instrument of Japan's maritime isolation. The convoys that had sustained an empire were reduced to desperate nighttime runs that usually ended in disaster. And the men on both sides, Japanese crews dying in sinking transports and American crews watching them die, paid the price for strategic decisions made by leaders thousands of miles away who would never experience combat themselves. When Captain Tanaka watched Kinka Maru explode and sink on October 12, 1943, he witnessed more than the destruction of a single ship. He witnessed the visible proof that Japan's war could not be sustained, that American industrial and tactical superiority was overwhelming, and that courage and determination could not overcome fundamental material disadvantages. That knowledge, once gained, could not be forgotten. It would color every subsequent operation, every convoy run, every strategic decision. The PT boats had achieved something beyond their simple mission of sinking ships. They had broken the assumption that Japan could continue fighting indefinitely. They had made defeat not just possible, but mathematically inevitable. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.